Well, let's stay in South Africa. Today, the Congress of South African Trade Unions marched in what they called a National Day of Action. Now, the list of demands included an increase in the National Social Grant, salary payments in certain municipalities, and municipal workers to be allowed to hold political party offices. Now, COSATU said the socio-economic issues were suffocating the economy and plunging workers in the country into debt. Well, let's now get an update on that strike action today. We're joined by Sumitra Naidu, who joins us in Johannesburg. Great to have you with us as always, Sumitra. Now, we heard a lot of good things about today's strike. We heard that COSATU's call for industrial action resonated across the country, especially given the tough economic realities right now in the country. But, Sumitra, did we see workers turning out en masse today? What were those demands?
Hi, Uche. Yeah, it certainly did resonate. Everyone is feeling the pinch. Unfortunately, as one economist pointed out today, they used the wrong instrument to address their concerns. There was a rather poor turnout today. And if you look at the issues the union is raising, the high cost of living, inflation, unemployment, for example, it is very high in South Africa. But those that do have jobs are doing everything they can to hold on to those jobs. They can't afford to be taking time off. Of course, the no work, no pay policy applies. Also, it doesn't sit well with employers. The economic environment is already under a huge amount of strain. Having workers off for a strike is a day of lost productivity. Now, COSATU is also demanding higher wages. If you look at the numbers, salaries and wages haven't increased as much as core inflation in the last few years. But inflation is still high and quite stubborn, and it affects the entire economy. So companies are also having to deal with rising costs. If wages are constantly increased and at higher than inflation rates, there are some demands for 10% wage hikes. If these are granted, this will only add to rising costs. Inflation will push up much higher. And of course, this leads to rate hikes, another concern raised by the union. And yes, it has been painful. The South African Reserve Bank has hiked rates 10 times since November 2021. That's a total of 475 basis points. And still, inflation is remaining stubbornly high, hovering around that 7% mark. But if the bank didn't take this issue seriously and hike rates, inflation would have been much higher than it is right now, and we would have been in a much more dire situation. So I think, Uche, really a tough one. I mean, these are real concerns, very valid concerns coming through from the union. But how, it's really a situation where the government isn't really acting and the SARB can't actually do much here.
You're right, between a rock and a hard place. But Sumitra, there's some speculation about how much this strike really impacted change today. Will it reach the government? Will it inspire real change with the SARB, for example? In light of today's turnout especially, how much of an impact do you think it will have?
Look, I don't think it's gone on deaf ears, but from an interest rate perspective, as I was saying, we may be nearing the end of the rate hiking cycle, but there's still so many factors, mostly global, that is creating uncertainty. You have interest rates also going up in the United States. The Russia-Ukraine situation, this is where most of the inflation is coming from. We saw a massive rise in oil prices, and that has had a significant impact on the entire economy. From a monetary policy perspective, economists believe the Reserve Bank is doing the right thing. It doesn't have any other tools to work with. In terms of addressing unemployment and the poor economy, this is where so much more has to be done. Government's initiatives to address unemployment haven't really worked. And some analysts say this is because the economy is just not growing. It's stuttering along. And unless you have solid economic growth, will you be able to create jobs? Structural reforms need to be addressed urgently. This is something also the Reserve Bank has been talking about and has raised, the governor has raised this issue on so many occasions, that structural reforms need to be addressed. The union's concerns are real and very valid. Whether they will get the attention they deserve, I'm not so sure. Uche?
Well, what happens after today's Sumitra? Will we see COSATU and, of course, all its other affiliate unions continuing this nationwide socio-economic strike?
Well, you know, Uche, it's hard to say. You know, this is becoming really concerning, and it's bread and butter issues as well. We're seeing a lot of hostility on the ground as well. People growing really impatient, and of course there are hardships. You know, the union is determined, but there just doesn't seem to be enough appetite. The unions are fighting very hard for higher wages. Last month we saw Eskom agreeing to a 7% wage hike for all workers. We saw Transnet also agreeing to higher wages after a long protracted strike that cost the economy millions. So the unions are digging in their heels because it has become that difficult to make ends meet. Food inflation is still hovering near 14-year highs at just over 13%. We're seeing a slight decline, but it's not enough to bring down the price of groceries. Add to this the high cost of transport, electricity, healthcare, education. It is becoming really expensive to live in South Africa, and you know, workers are really struggling to get by. And when you talk about this hostility that's brewing on the ground, it becomes a really concerning situation, and something that government will need to look at to find some solutions.